We are live, coming to you from the MGM Grand Arena in Las Vegas, Iowa. It's time! 5 hours from my room, the Midwestern Marx stream. Oh yeah, hello everyone. You will be remembered as a hero of the revolution. Wow, you're too kind. We'll see. We just got to do what we can, move history forward, act as agents of history as much as possible. And then, we'll let the future people decide who they want to write about in their history books. Solidarity from Baltimore, USA. Solidarity, comrade. Thank you for the kind words and the support. Really appreciate it. I mean, I do believe that we're moving forward right now, right? And whether that's because of Midwestern Marx, I mean, we're doing what we can and what we think is the best strategy, best way forward. But I think, as a collective, as a group of socialists and Marxists, we really are moving forward. We're moving towards developing ourselves theoretically, becoming a truly advanced, theoretically advanced section of the working class, of the working mass. So, yeah, I think we're headed in that direction. This is going to be a long and hard struggle, especially since the CIA and other arms of the ruling class bourgeoisie have done everything they can to prevent leftist socialist working class organization for years, infiltrating our organizations, spreading pseudo-Marxist ideas like the Frankfurt School, and this this pro-imperialist socialism, which of course there can be no socialism without anti-imperialism. These are ideologies that have been perpetrated by the ruling class for years. But we're breaking through it. We're breaking through it by becoming a theoretically advanced section of the working class ourselves and by continuing to organize. So, yes, wherever capitalism goes, no matter how powerful the bourgeoisie seems, it always creates its antithesis, the working mass and the revolutionary working mass, which can eventually bring about the destruction of the bourgeoisie and the capitalist class itself. Socialism's like the shadow of capitalism. So even when the ruling class, launches Operation Condor across Latin America, and they kill and torture anybody, with any kind of progressive seeming or left-wing or socialistic ideology. In Chile, they round people up and put them in the national soccer stadium and commit a horrible massacre of anybody with a left-wing socialist ideology, all backed and supported by the CIA. And yet, even after that, even after Operation Condor, even after they tried to root the socialist and revolutionary ideology and organization out of that country, out of that continent, even then, we still have socialists winning election today, organizing today. We still have the Sandinistas in power in Nicaragua. We still have the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, Bolivia, continuing to construct socialism. A new wave of social democratic or socialistic candidates taking power in Colombia and in Chile, elsewhere, even though, we have our really, biting critiques of like Gabriel Boric. And so some of the other social democrats who have come to power in Latin America, Pedro Castillo. But still, it shows that grassroots effort and that grassroots longing for socialism is still there. The people still understand that neoliberalism or trickle-down economics, which was imposed on Latin America by the West, is a lie. They realize it doesn't work for anybody except for the corporations exploiting us. And even though the U.S. has tried to stomp that idea out, stomp out the idea of socialism, torture and kill the idea of socialism out of the entire continent of Latin America, they haven't been able to, which shows that socialism will follow capitalism wherever it goes. And the bourgeoisie knows this, and it gives them anxiety. It gives them class anxiety. They're terrified of the working masses realizing their power. And we're helping people realize their power, as are all of you in the audience. So solidarity with everyone. I love your video on imperialism and support for the DPRK in Cuba. That's why I became a fan of your work. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, sometimes, I mean, especially online, there's a tendency to just be like, you're anti-Cuba or you have criticisms of the Cuban government or the DPRK. F you. And I've fallen into that before too, because it's frustrating when you have people calling themselves socialists who are dismissing every socialist country around the world who the U.S. is targeting with imperialist aggression. But like, if you never have that explained to you, how are you supposed to make your way out of the propaganda bubble, right? And what Domenico Lacerdo does so well is he really explains this, explains how and why socialists support a certain country, from on a systematic philosophical level. So what he does, like in that video about the DPRK, he makes like a graph of a tree. And he says the roots of the tree are self-determination. If a people don't have self-determination and the right to govern themselves and control and have their own state, then there can't be a nation, and they can't protect themselves and they can't construct socialism. Now, following the right to self-determination, Lacerdo and other Marxists support economic independence, economic freedom. So making sure the masses have control of production, how society produces and distributes goods, making sure that they have their material needs met. That's the next thing socialists support. And then the leaves of the tree, which can grow out of economic independence and which can only grow out of self-determination, you have civil and political rights, which is what Roland Bohr and Carlos Martinez and some other really great Marxist academics have been looking at with human rights, talking about how liberals just use human rights in a vacuum, right? That country's abusing human rights, this broad abstract ideal that the U.S. is allowed to invade countries for, of human rights. And when really human rights grow out of self-determination and economic independence. So as, China has constructed socialism, at first the party cadres were making sure that every locality had food and every locality had water and every locality was working on developing their industry. Today in China, the party cadres are making sure everybody has Wi-Fi, right? And that every city is not only industrialized, but is moving towards being more sustainable, right? So these lead to more civil and political rights, more human rights for the Chinese people, but they're human rights that would have been impossible if they hadn't increased their productive forces, right? If they hadn't constructed socialism and given people material economic independence. Whereas in the U.S., we're constantly selling our labor at the market because we don't have any economic independence, because we'll starve and die if we don't constantly find someone to sell our labor to. China is working on creating that economic independence, which can lead to more civil and political rights. Meanwhile, the U.S. just points at a country, says they're abusing human rights in the abstract, and then uses that as justification to attack them. So what Domenico Lacerdo does with that great tree graph is shows that, first, as socialists, especially socialists living in the empire, we have to support self-determination, right? Even if we disagree with a country and how they want to govern themselves, they still have the right to govern themselves that way, as long as they're not attacking and invading other countries, right? So we support self-determination first. Second, you support economic independence. You support the construction of socialism, bringing people out of poverty, meeting their material needs. Economic independence can't come unless you first have the roots of the tree. Economic independence grows out of self-determination. And then civil and political rights grow out of economic independence, which would be impossible without self-determination, which is something that's like impossible for most Americans to understand, because we've been brainwashed with this like liberal idea of human rights. that we just have human rights and other countries, they don't have human rights. We're not going to concretely define what human rights mean. Just trust us. Those other countries like Iraq don't have human rights. That's why we have to invade them and kill millions of people to protect human rights. Of course, it makes no sense. But what I really like about Carlos Martinez and Roland Bohr's work is they're showing how it makes no sense. And Lacerdo, they're showing how civil and political rights can only grow out of economic independence. So if you support overthrowing North Korea, like Vaush does for human rights, you're taking away the self-determination of those people. You're taking away the economic independence of those people. You're taking away all of their civil and political rights and their ability to develop their own, better civil and political rights. And you're saying you're doing it for the purpose of civil and political rights. It's such nonsense. All right, that was a long rant. Good morning, Sir Eddie. Hello, Alexander the Average. The Discord, Midwestern Marx Discord regular and comrade extraordinaire, patron as well, I believe, Alexander the Average. Hello, comrade. Join our Discord, by the way, folks. Link is in my link tree. Liberals and SOCDEMs are closeted fascists. They want to save capitalism and bend over to the ruling class. They're the true enemies of the proletariat. There are a lot of true enemies of the proletariat, but yeah, I mostly agree with what you're saying. And that's why we, social democrats in the past have been called social fascists, because they're class collaborationists, and class collaborationism always leads to fascism, which is violent capitalism and decay. Look at all the social democratic countries who are throwing all their support and funding behind Ukraine right now, right? Or who did so whenever NATO asked them to, which, NATO is a borderline fascist imperialist organization. And look at all the liberals who just, are literally waving Ukraine flags and yelling Slava Ukraini, which is a phrase that originated with the Ukrainian extremist nationalists in World War II, the fascists. Look at the way the Social Democrats in Germany, all the way back in 1919, I believe was the year, who collaborated with the fascists, helped Hitler come to power and specifically collaborated with them to kill Rosa Luxemburg, one of the leaders of the communist movement in Germany. So, class collaborationism will always lend itself to fascism, which is, the ruling class violently and often in a racist way suppressing the working mass, preventing them from rising up against their poor material conditions. And yeah, I do think they're mostly the enemies of the working class, but there's times when it's good to collaborate with them. Honestly, there's times when it's good to collaborate with social democrats, whether you're talking internationally, in trading with social democratic countries, or in organizing against imperialist aggression here at home, organizing in a lot of ways here at home. But yeah, never forget what they are, and never be afraid to point out to social democrats and to the people social democrats are talking to why their ideology has always historically lent itself to fascism, because it's ultimately class collaborationist. And we can only crush fascism and racism by crushing class society and the divisions of class society. Boom. Borderline fasci, NATO ain't on the border. They're in the heartland. Facts, Ross. Yeah, I shouldn't have said. I thought that too when I said borderline. I'm like, it's not really borderline. By every standard, NATO pretty much is. Yeah. I consider myself a Marxist-Leninist who believes that Cuba and Vietnam are socialist, but the DPRK and PRC have been going through state capitalist reforms. In the case of China, this would be post-Mao era. And would you call me an ML? Yeah, I would because obviously you still support self-determination in Cuba and, in the DPRK and the PRC. So it's not like you support the U.S. overthrowing them. Unless you do, then I would say you're not an ML. But it's fine to have criticisms of their process of constructing socialism, right? It's fine to have those debates. I would have that debate with you, obviously. Carlos and I would argue that the DPRK and the PRC are socialist, and I can go into some of the reasons for that in a second. But, as long as we're doing it in good faith and in a forum where we know, that the audience or the people listening to us talk aren't going to be confused and think that we are advocating for imperialism, advocating for the overthrow of the DPRK. As long as you're not advocating for that, you can have these debates. And I would say that Cuba has and Vietnam have gone in the same direction as China since they've seen the success of China's reform and opening up period. So, China knew they were allowing basically more capitalism into their country, but they knew it would give them access to global markets, global finance, which they could use to develop socialism. And, now with their poverty alleviation programs, their anti-corruption campaigns, they're moving back, in that direction towards, I guess, a more traditional form of socialism, but not more traditional because it's a more advanced form of socialism. It's a sublated form of socialism. And yeah, and Cuba and the DPRK as well have seen what China's doing and have also opened themselves up to a little bit more privatization and trying to create these specific economic zones where Western companies can invest and make money and therefore use those resources to build up socialism. It leads to more corruption within the state and within the Communist Party, and these Marxist countries like China and their theorists have recognized this, and that's why you have the anti-corruption efforts that have swept across China, rooting out capitalist corruption within the state apparatus and within the party. But ultimately, they're still socialists. Really, what Mao was doing was a more Stalinist approach. Mao was doing a more top-down. We need to build up our industry right now. We need to use the agricultural surplus that's created by the peasant class in order to build up our industry and build up the proletariat. And there was something very similar that Stalin was doing in the USSR because they were preparing for the German invasion. As well as preparing, all the Western countries after the October Revolution invaded the Soviet Union. So they needed to divert a bunch of money into military spending and divert a bunch of their country's surplus into developing their industry if they were going to survive and defeat the Yazis, which every Western military analyst at the time was saying the Yazis were going to crush Russia or the Soviet Union in World War II. But they didn't because of this top-down planning model. But before Stalin, Lenin had the NEP, which I think somebody was talking about that in the chat. Lenin suggested the NEP, the new economic policy, which is basically, I think he even uses the word state capitalism, right? And he says we're going to need to learn to work together with capitalists in order to construct socialism. So the NEP would have just been like a slower transition, a less top-down transition to socialism. It would have allowed for more market reforms, more private investment, just more market commodity trade in general, and then you have people nowadays who are like, oh, allowing any markets into a country means it's not real socialism because you haven't abolished the commodity form. But it's like, this is what Lenin was arguing originally, right? And socialism under Stalin and Mao ended up having to be, more top down or authoritarian, for lack of a better word, controlling the economy to make sure that the productive forces could be developed and they could survive. But what Deng Xiaoping said is, now Deng Xiaoping, the whole time Mao was ruling China, was arguing for a more Leninist model, a more NEP style model. He was saying we need to allow more private investment in. And when Mao Zedong dies, Deng Xiaoping takes power, and that's what he does. And then, a bunch of people, including my hero Parenti, were like, oh, China's neoliberal now. Right. And it did look like that for a while. It looked like China was abandoning communism and going towards neoliberalism. But of course, that's not what happened. They had just built a base, an industrial and agricultural base under Mao with this more top-down Stalinist model. And then they allowed foreign investment on top of that to strengthen and deepen the construction that had happened under Mao using the more Leninist model, the Deng Xiaoping model, which people call reformist. So I guess Lenin is a reformist too, but so that would be my argument about that. But yeah, I would still consider you an ML even if you have criticisms of those countries' economies. Lenin, Cuba and Vietnam opened up to foreign trade because they were forced to by the IMF and the World Bank. I feel like the PRC and the DPRK mostly gave up on economic planning. But so I don't understand that argument. The DPRK isn't even part of the IMF and World Bank. They're one of the only countries in the world, including socialist countries, who aren't even allowed to work with the IMF and World Bank because of human rights abuses. So I've heard Maoists actually say that the DPRK is the only real form of socialism left because they still do have so much economic planning. But I'm curious as to what, just because they trade so much with China, you think they've given up economic planning? Because I mean, they haven't at all. Their agricultural system is like completely collectivized. One sec. There's a really good movie called My Brothers and Sisters in the North, where this journalist travels across North Korea. It's a journalist from the South. And she just, looks at what everyday life is like in North Korea, especially for the agricultural workers. And I mean, it's definitely a planned economy. The agricultural workers in this movie talk to her about the planned economy, and they're like, in America, if you make too much food, you have to throw it away if nobody can pay for it. You throw your surplus away. Capitalism is so wasteful. Here in the DPRK, we grow what everyone needs and we distribute it equally, based on what the needs of the country are. This is socialism. And obviously that could only be done via planning, via economic planning. So hi, just joined the live. What are your thoughts on China's current economy that might collapse in a month because of the housing crisis they created? That's just an absolute Western lie. Well, I mean, I promise you, in a month, China's economy is not going to collapse. The press might pretend like it is, but it's not. That I mean, literally, there's something like 20% of people in China now have two houses because their housing programs have been so successful. And if you can see this, even if you go, like, there's videos of people touring even lower income places in China, cities in China that aren't the center of commerce and trade and have all this wealth, um, like Shanghai or whatever. And even the poorer cities in China make the richest cities in the US look like slums. Because in the richest cities in the US, in LA and New York, you have giant skyscrapers controlled by people with vast amounts of wealth, vast accumulated wealth, which is why we're the richest country in the world. But then below those skyscrapers, you have people sleeping on the streets, right? Because we don't use this vast material wealth we have to take care of our population. We allow tons of homeless people to sleep on the streets, even though we have more empty houses than we have homeless people in this whole country. So, it's literally embarrassing as a country when you look at China and they don't have as much overall wealth, but they're able to house all their people and they're able to take care of the masses. And in the US, even in the richest places, you have people on the streets everywhere because the more wealth in the US that's concentrated, the more wealth inequality. So that wealth will never trickle down to the bottom and it's never going to take those people off the streets. So capitalism can build more houses than we need, but it can't house everybody. It's the problem at the core of the system. 90% of China has a house. How many Americans have a house? I don't know. I don't know if that statistic about China is right. That may be Chinese people who own their house, who don't have any debt on their house. Oh, maybe that's what you were saying. Maybe that's what this person was saying. 90% of them actually own their house, like it's theirs. In the US, we're all making payments on our house or renting. And the strata of capitalists who are, currently make up the ruling class and currently control our politics. A lot of them are real estate capitalists or bankers or banks connect, banks who own real estate, because you take out a loan with the bank in order to buy real estate. But a lot of these are just like housing development companies or like, massive landlord companies that are collecting tons of rent or, tons on housing payments every year. And in 2008, we had this giant financial crisis caused by the crash of the housing industry. Like, how do people not look at this and realize it's the most irrational thing ever? To allow this like small group of bankers and real estate capitalists to just hoard the housing and charge us all up the wazoo, charge us interest up the wazoo, for us to live in shelter, which is a necessity in the modern world. Crazy. China basically built a crap ton of houses using a lot of foreign investment. They can't move people into them fast enough. So the property developers don't want to keep spending money to build. Once this bubble bursts, the investors, mostly foreign and and richer Chinese, will be underwater. Okay. And I imagine the party, I know, I'm sure they have a plan for this to, make sure that people don't end up being homeless, but yeah, that's going to hurt the foreign property investors. And that's the thing about China, like they are still socialist. So in the US, we have a bunch of bankers and Silicon Valley, like tech capitalists and then real estate capitalists. Their industries that they own aren't producing anything. They're not manufacturing anything. They're just charging people on rent, or they're making their money up in the cloud, or they're, putting interest on loans. Like that's what, obviously the banks use all sorts of magic to make their money, without actually producing anything. But in China, they've they basically manufacture everything now, right? And Venezuela has talked about doing this as well with the Belt and Road Initiative. They're actually building up their productive base, their real material economy. They actually produce things. So, China has all these houses that have been built by foreign investment. If the bubble bursts, China's government and their party realizes that we still have these houses, right? The financial bubble burst, but we still have houses that people can live in. So China's not just going to, kick all these people out of their houses, just evict people in mass. They can plan for this the way that we couldn't plan, for the 2008 financial housing crisis. We just bailed out the banks, because capitalism doesn't know how to alleviate these crises. Versus economic planning and socialism, even if you do have the issues that come with markets, like China does with the housing bubble being an example, you can plan around them, right? And you can plan and make sure that it doesn't impact people's lives materially, impact their means of subsistence materially. Yeah. Marx predicted as the rate of profit and industrial production declined, the lords of capital transferred their money to speculation and what I call paper shuffling. Boom! Big G Haywood. Thank you, Big Bill Haywood, who said, I've never read the works of Marx, I've never read Marx's Capital, but I have the marks of capital on my body, all over my body. Great Big Bill Haywood quote, but you're exactly right. Marx predicted this, that and paper shuffling is a great thing to call it. Marx predicted that all this money would be transferred to speculation, right? Charging people on interest, charging people on real estate. Now with the technological revolution, which Marx, never got to see, we have all these Silicon Valley capitalists making money off subscription services and, making money that I say is in the cloud. Ultimately it's just paper shuffling. These subscription companies like Hulu and Disney or whatever, they're not actually producing movies or producing art. They're just charging you for the streaming service. And there's all these different ways that capitalists have found to nickel and dime us now. And meanwhile, most of our manufacturing and our actually productive jobs are being outsourced to other countries. So, in a time of economic crisis, or as economic crises continue to happen in the US, they're going to get worse and worse and worse because of that. Said 20% of China has two houses. The second house is for investment. It causes the housing bubbles. Xi said houses are for living in, not investment. Now high tax for investment housing. So that thing I mentioned earlier about Chinese people owning two houses, this person's arguing that that's possibly what created the housing bubble, because people own these second housings for speculation and investment, which again, that shows another example of like China's market reforms allowed bourgeois, or as Deng Xiaoping said, he said, once we open up to foreign capital, it's going to allow petty bourgeois ideology to infiltrate China. That would be exactly what he means, right? Now that, there is such thing as a housing market, now that it's not planned by the government, Chinese citizens are saying, oh, I can invest on a second home, right? I have all this money. I can own a second home and use that as a capital investment to make money. Petty bourgeois ideology, not bourgeois ideology, not the same ideology as oligarchs who run oil companies or whatever, but petty bourgeois ideology, trying to get a competitive edge and get ahead by investing on a second home. And that's now what China is trying to combat, and what they've been really trying to combat ever since they went ahead with the market reforms. Because China uses Marxism to understand how capitalism works, they knew what would happen when they opened up to capitalist markets. They knew that they would be dealing with these things. Uh, all right, I'm gonna run to the bathroom before we talk about this first video here from Hans-Georg Muller. So let me pull up something for the people to watch while I run to the bathroom. Um, I don't want to leave y'all with no entertainment, right? Um, Crypto and capitalism are an anarchic monstrosity, exploitative mess. Yeah, but someone was suggesting the other day that, crypto is sort of like a decentralized form of currency, or basically just like a pyramid scheme, that capitalists are using to do what they want. But like the DPRK is using crypto as well, because it is a decentralized form of currency that isn't necessarily tied to the IMF, World Bank, the petrodollar, the basically US financial institutions, which allow the dollar to be the dominant currency on the global stage. The DPRK is using crypto to circumnavigate that. And this person on Twitter was saying all communists should just study crypto really hard and start using crypto in our favor. Start using it to fund our operations or organizations, because it's a decentralized form of currency that they're less able to control. Um, and yeah, I don't know crypto well enough. I've been thinking, like, since it has to do with money and currency, and Marx talks so much about that, I'm like, eventually here I have to study crypto. Like, I have to do a deep dive into crypto. And I've started doing that, but I haven't, gone deep enough. But after seeing that tweet, about how Marxists should learn to use crypto and use it against the ruling class, like, it seems like a great idea. Does it not? All right, y'all. Here, you can watch me wrestle while I run to the bathroom, and then discuss crypto in the comments if you want. And I'll come back and read your chats when I return from peeing. Come on, load already. There we go. Enjoy, comrades. I almost got thrown in my back. I did get thrown in my back, really. Shoot, I gotta go this way. How am I doing, folks? I'll leave this matchup while I read the comments, I guess. Um. Oprah, Xi Jinping, you get a house, you got a house, you get a house. They gave everyone free housing. That would equate for the first time to the government actually doing something to help the working masses, something that they are completely averse to doing. Yes, they won't do it at all. And this is why, like, even though Medicaid and Medicare are the most popular, insurance programs in the country, they're the most popular form of healthcare funding in the country. People like them the most compared to private insurance, obviously. Medicare and Medicaid are constantly being demonized and are constantly being cut by Republicans because they realize that it helps people. They realize that people like Medicaid and Medicare as opposed to having nothing. So they can't ever take it away, but they're constantly trying to cut it and make it more inefficient. So then they can point and say, look, the government never does anything. The government never does anything that works. Oh, look, after we completely dismantled Medicaid, it stopped working. Oh, it's the government's fault. The government can't do anything. Because if people knew that the government actually helps them, if, when the government actually invests their money in helping the public, it does help the public. Or when they use their power to rein in the private sector, it does help the working mass. If people figured that out, it would be bad for the government. So they absolutely can't do anything. They literally won't even give a freaking inch. Crypto is merely a speculative asset. It has no real value. Neither do most Western currencies. True. Neither does money in general, other than the value that it's given by the state. Anymore, at least after money stopped being backed by gold. Venezuela has a cryptocurrency called Petro. Interesting. 50 computers running 24/7 isn't really anything compared to the fumes we pump out every day. Oh, someone was talking about how crypto is environmentally destructive. 50 computers running 24/7, very damaging. Yeah, I mean, right, like, it's nothing compared to the fossil fuel industry, I guess. So I see what you're saying, though, for sure. The amount of cow farts is worse than $50, literally. Oh, I won. Yay. Go me. That guy came out strong, but I literally choked him. And I won. So we did it. I wish I could wrestle anyone who talks bad about us on Twitter. Wouldn't that be nice? Sounds a bit contradictory. Who would take that seriously? Who would take what seriously? Using crypto? Doesn't matter who takes it seriously. It matters how we can use it materially. Right? Like, I see what you're getting at. Nobody would take it seriously because we're communists using crypto. Communists and socialists believe socialism will grow out of capitalism. Marx literally said that capitalism creates its own grave diggers. Capitalism creates the tools that will bring about its own destruction, the instruments that will bring about its own destruction. Capitalists will sell us the rope that we use to hang them, or hang capitalism. All of these are quotes from Marx or Lenin, because to have a scientific understanding of socialism means understanding that we live in capitalism now, and we have to construct socialism out of capitalism. So we should use any of the tools that are at our disposal under capitalism in order to bring about socialism. This is something that Western Marxists often have a very hard time understanding, and it's a difference between utopian idealist socialism, which is anti-Marxist, versus Marx and Engels' scientific socialism. Scientific socialism understands that we can't just create a perfect system in a vacuum and implement it tomorrow, right? We need to build that system out of the one we currently have, and we need to organize against our current ruling class if we're going to take power and be able to build that system. So, when people are like, say, oh, you're using your iPhone to post TikTok videos, yet you're a communist, how contradictory. You're not very serious. Like, yes, of course, I live in capitalism, and capitalism and the technological revolution created this iPhone, this means of communication, a means of communication that communists before us did not have. So if we weren't using this means of communication to organize and spread socialist education, we wouldn't be using the instruments that capitalism creates to bring about its own destruction, and we would just be naive and silly. and the ruling class is going to do everything they can to stop us from organizing and destroying us. And if we're naive at all, if we don't understand what the actual situation is, or don't use everything we can to win, we're not going to win, right? If our morality gets in the way of our strategy and pragmatism, right? Like, we're all driven by morality, personal morality in some sense, but if we're like, oh, I really, really want to buy this video camera because I've been reading Marx for the past 2 years, and I want to educate people about Marx, but I'm not going to do it because I'm a communist and I can't ever spend money. Like, you're letting idealism and morality prevent you from constructing socialism or doing something that would bring about socialism. So we need to use all of the instruments that are at our disposal, and if that means using crypto, we shouldn't feel bad about it because right wingers are like, oh, you're communist using crypto. Like, yeah, okay, let me explain scientific socialism to you and why you're a numbnuts using crypto. Oh, no, we were talking about conservative communism. I agree with all the crypto stuff. Okay. Well, sorry for directing that rant at you then, but it was a rant worth having. He do be spitting though, 100. Yes. Thank you, Teddy Ursa's Journeys. Much love. Sorry, I got confused there. But yes, thank you for letting me go on that rant about scientific socialism and strategy. It's stupid because it's not like we can't make computer chips and communism. And Project Cybersyn, Chile was making like an automated computerized economy in like the 70s. They were doing that in the 70s. And now we talked to Dr. Paul Cockshot about this, who's a Marxist computer scientist with a funny last name. Sorry, Dr. Cockshot. I've gotten used to his last name now, but every time I say it, people are like, haha, Cockshot. But anyways, he's told us, the software and the programming and the technology we have now would make Project Cybersyn so much easier. So much easier. And of course, we have computers in the size of a little iPhone in our pocket that can do what, the computers of yesteryear could do, all combined into one. But the U.S. destroyed Project Cybersyn. They destroyed Project Cybersyn by ousting Salvador Allende and putting Augusto Pinochet in power, then rounded up and killed all the socialist leftists, and demolished Project Cybersyn in the economic planning. Good job, imperialism. There's capitalism creating innovation again, right? Oh, look at this great innovation in computer science coming out of the socialist country. Let's bomb them and put a fascist gangster in power of the country instead. Innovation. Wait, metal, rubber, gas, electricity all disappears as soon as you do communism? Yes, we're all going to live in a big tent. There's going to be a tent in every country, one per country, and that is called the socialism tent. Okay, and we all sit in the socialism tent and we share everything. Communism is when all of the countries combine their socialism tent and it becomes one big global communism tent. And we stand in there and we knit and we grow potatoes and we feed them to each other by hand. We don't use silverware. And that's communism, and that's just better than our current society. It's called tent communism. It's Minecraft, yes. The pickaxe disappears when you do communism. You have to break trees with your hand now because the axe you had was sold at Home Depot, yes. And there's no Home Depot without under socialism. I'm going to go outside and punch my tree later today, and then I'm going to film it and upload it as a TikTok and say, this is the future socialists want. And then you will all know what I'm talking about, and nobody else will. Isn't communism when the government does a whole lot of stuff? Yes. That is what it is. Alrighty. So some of you have probably seen, and I know there was a conversation about conservative communism in the chat. I didn't want to jump in on that because I don't define myself as a conservative communist. I don't even think like Haas or of Infrared or any of those guys can like self-label as that. Maybe I'm wrong. But, what we have been talking about, like Midwestern Marx has always been in favor of the liberation and the struggle of oppressed groups, oppressed communities, minority communities. We've done lots of videos about feminism and the women's struggle, and talked about how class struggle and these other struggles need to always be intertwined, and how, true liberation, like women's liberation, trans liberation, black liberation, things like that, are all need the class struggle, because the ruling class utilizes racism, bigotry, xenophobia in order to keep the masses divided. So only by struggling against them materially can we truly bring about liberation for people. But we need that class struggle, right? We need that class element. Class is what's universal. Class is what binds us all together, despite our various identity groups, or despite, cultural differences. We have more in common with the working class of any country than we do with our own ruling class, our own capitalist class, which is what we've been getting at. And that is what Dr. Hans-Georg Moeller is getting at with his criticism of what he calls wokeism. So I've recommended an original video here from Carefree Wandering or Hans-Georg Moeller a lot of times, called Wokeism, where he basically, and Hans-Georg Moeller is a German philosopher right now studying and teaching in China. I believe he's a Marxist. But what he says is that in the American academies and the Western academies and in the Western left, identity politics and issues of identity are being placed over issues of class, and are actually being used as a way to distract from issues of class. Race essentialist politics are being pushed rather than class essentialist politics, right? And this is most obviously exemplified by the U.S. empire, by the CIA doing these recruitment videos where they market themselves as very woke, as very progressive, as very inclusive to different gender identities, different sexual identities, different racial and ethnic identities. Um, and, again, going back to class, the only way to identify who the imperialists are, and who is actually doing these acts of imperialist aggression, is now by class, right? By understanding that these organizations like the CIA serve the ruling capitalist class, not any one, identity of people. And, regardless of what identity you are, if you're going to help the CIA do imperialism, they're going to accept you. And the irony is, helping the empire actually prevents the liberation of various oppressed identity groups, right? So the empire is co-opting the struggle of different oppressed groups, bringing it into the fold of imperialism, and using it to try and maintain the status quo. And Dr. Hans-Georg Moeller compares this to what he calls German guilt pride, which is something that happened in Germany after World War II, where there was basically a competition between all the leftists to say, I'm the most sorry about World War II. I'm the most sorry about Hitler. I hate my own home country. And it sort of becomes like a form of reverse nationalism, which prevents organizing and struggle to make the nation better, the country better. So he compares it to that, and then he also compares it to civil religion, right? He says in the past, imperialism has used Christianity, right? You just need to believe in this authority. You need to work hard. We need to spread freedom, and we need to evangelize other countries, bring civilization and our correct religion elsewhere. And this was the ideology of imperialism, or the religion of imperialism, which is part of the ideology of imperialism. And Hans-Georg Moeller is saying that now wokeism, for many, many, many Americans, and I think he says the majority of Americans, wokeism has replaced Christianity as the civil religion, right? We need to invade Afghanistan and occupy them for women's rights, or the CIA is now a good thing because they have non-binary people on their staff, right? Using various gender identities to try and justify the most horrific capitalist imperialist actions. And in doing so, they distract people from where this this imperialist violence and all the bad things about capitalism are stemming from, which is the capitalist relation. Of course, we know it's not stemming from any one identity group, although, in the US, traditionally white supremacy has, of course, been used, and homophobia have traditionally been used to prop up the existing ruling class. But Hans-Georg Moeller here is kind of noticing a shift in strategy, right? A shift where they're like, we're still race essentialists, right? We're still going to use race to keep the working masses divided. But we won't be explicitly racist because there's been so much struggle against racism and against the militarized racist police in the US that the ruling class has no choice but to co-opt it, right? To take it and make it a ruling class ideology. And that's what wokeism is really to Hans-Georg Moeller. So he did another video about it here recently. Carlos wrote him, I know, recently with a paper that he did sort of expanding on some of Hans-Georg Moeller's work and using it to analyze imperialism. So I don't know if that influenced this video from Hans-Georg Moeller. It could have. I know he read Carlos's work, but I'm sure he has lots of good people writing him that encourage him to make more videos or think or flesh this theory out a little more broadly. So without any further ado, let's watch this new video he released. He's now done like 4 or 5 videos on wokeism, but this one is called Woke, the 5 Essentials You Need to Know.
I'd like to talk about wokeism again, about the 5 essentials of wokeism. And I'd like to do so by talking about an essay written by Christopher Mott, a US-based political scientist.
Let me know if it's too quiet or too loud.
And an interview Mott gave with Max Blumenthal on the Gray Zone. Number 1, wokeism is good or God for the imperium. Mott writes, social justice causes and rhetoric are adopted as the explicit goals of the United States foreign policy. Such use and weaponization of the language of justice to advance the foreign policy objectives is particularly evident against regions and countries the West believes actively challenge the liberal international order, status quo, or where it seeks to justify military and economic interventions on normative grounds.
Sorry, I had myself muted. This is nothing new for the empire, really, right? They're co-opting now social justice struggles, but they've always told us, country A is abusing human rights. We need to go in and stop them. The DPRK is abusing human rights. We need to carpet bomb their country and kill 20% of their population. Iraq and Afghanistan, we have to go in there because they're abusing human rights. They're abusing women's rights. Ignore Saudi Arabia, who's backed up by the U.S., who's been backed by the U.S. for years, who in 2018 just finally allowed women the right to drive. Forget the U.S.'s allies. They're not abusing human rights. These countries the U.S. wants to destroy are abusing human rights. And it's always abstract, right? It's always idealist. The U.S. very, very never systematically explains how many human rights abuses a country has to make before we invade or whatever. It's just whatever country we don't like, they're abusing human rights, and therefore that's the only reason we need to invade them. Right now they're using, this country's abusing women's rights. This country doesn't have good LGBTQ rights. China doesn't. We need to sanction them and attack them and do destabilization towards them. This is becoming sort of the new face and the new rhetoric that the empire uses to justify invading countries for human rights.
And then he writes, the military-industrial complex is perfectly capable and incentivized to assimilate their social justice advocates' language and repurpose it for its own internationalist or militarized ends. Wokeness, after all, is good for the imperium. Whether it's good for the nation that hosts the imperium, however, is a very different question. 2 examples for how the military-industrial complex utilizes and reappropriates wokeism. One is a video that Mott and Blumenthal discuss in their conversation. And it's a new woke US Army advertisement that shows an LGBTQ person as some kind of a model soldier, clearly appropriating woke imagery for the purpose of promoting the US military and, of course, thereby promoting the activities of the US military. The second example is the recent visit by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, where she also, at least on the side, spoke about LGBTQ issues and so forth. Now here, too, wokeism is utilized for highlighting a very strong difference between the US and by extension the West and somehow the evil forces that oppose it.
Very true. Shoot, I forgot what I was gonna say. Dang it, I totally forgot what I was gonna say. Either way, we'll just keep watching.
And it is used to justify the...
Yeah, I remembered what I was gonna say. The other day on stream, we broke down Human Rights Watch doing this investigation of conversion therapy in China, right? And the title was "Conversion Therapy is Rampant in China." And then Human Rights Watch is a U.S. Western-backed NGO who's supposed to do investigations or investigative reports. So then they're often used as a source by Western corporate media. So CNN, MSNBC, these other outlets. Oh, did I lose internet connection? It says I lost all my viewers. Okay, we're back. We're back. Sorry, I glitched out there for a second. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. But Human Rights Watch was doing this report about China, saying that they were doing conversion therapy. And then we dug into the report on stream. The evidence for their report was 17 anonymous phone calls. 17 anonymous people who called Human Rights Watch or were contacted by Human Rights Watch and said, yeah, I had this experience in China where basically I was shamed by my family for being gay, and they tried to take me to a doctor to turn me not gay, and it didn't work. And that stuff is horrible, right? That stuff is horrible. The fact that people face discrimination from their family for being LGBTQ, and then that their family would want them to get medical help for something that they're born with, and that doesn't need to be treated medically or can't be treated medically. But Human Rights Watch and all of U.S. media were in unison accusing China of doing conversion therapy. And therefore, of course, we need to sanction China or investigate China, or the UN needs to condemn China, or we need to invade China. When in the U.S., conversion therapy is still legal in more than 50% of our states. There's like 25% of states still allow conversion therapy, and there's 3 or 4 states that have laws protecting conversion therapy, saying, no, you can't get rid of conversion therapy. It goes in the reverse. Yet these 17 anonymous phone calls require all of U.S. media to attack China and say they're not as woke as us. They're not as, accepting of LGBTQ people as us. Therefore, we need to do imperialist aggression, which is extremely problematic, especially when you look at the US and you realize that we're legally doing conversion therapy. There was a study a few years back that found Americans are paying millions of dollars on conversion therapy every single year. But where is the investigations into the US? Where are the investigations into our abuses of human rights? Where was the US media on this? Their goal wasn't actually ever to call out human rights abuses. It wasn't ever to protect the LGBTQ community. Their goal was to threaten China and to make a report that makes China look anti-woke. So when we criticize wokeism, and I know this is going to be impossible for Twitter Marxists to understand, when we criticize wokeism, we're not criticizing the LGBTQ struggle or the LGBTQ community. We're criticizing the empire co-opting that struggle and using that struggle to justify aggression towards China, when we should be turning the mirror or turning the magnifying glass on ourselves, and looking at how our own government and how our ruling class oppresses the LGBTQ community here. But we don't do that because it's not actually liberation that they're interested in. It's not liberation that the ruling class likes. It's wokeism, which is liberation co-opted. Liberation of oppressed communities co-opted and used as rhetoric to justify destroying other countries with imperialist, pro-capitalist violence. And I mean, like, Vaush is like the human embodiment of that. Country X is evil. They don't have the woke policies that I prefer. Let's just sanction them and destroy them. You rah rah, US and NATO. Vaush is the human embodiment of woke imperialism.
West Western military presence all over the world. Now, importantly, no matter how one sees this, Nancy Pelosi here clearly, and I think quite intentionally, uses wokeism in order to highlight tensions. This is very different from the approach of leftist Western politicians, for instance, in the 1970s. At that time, the newly elected German leftist chancellor, Willy Brandt, was famous for his so-called Entspannungspolitik, détente policy. He actually even got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And very much different from today's wokeism. At that time, leftist politicians tried to decrease tensions between the West and the East, and instead tried to promote forms of mediation that led to demilitarization. Today, with wokeism, we see the exact opposite dynamism unfolding. In this sense, I think Mott is right. Wokeism is appropriated for basically US American geostrategic and European internationalist and militarist purposes. But what is religious about this? What is civil religious about this? Well, I think quite clearly wokeism has replaced Christian religion as the main ideological justification for global expansion. Instead of the Christian salvation narrative, we now have a liberation narrative focused on human rights. Number two, wokeism is a, but not the, civil religion. Mott speaks of a wokist incarnation of American globalist evangelism. And he traces wokist civil religion back to what he calls a certain idealistic and moralistic element in Anglo-American culture that dates back to the rise of Puritanism in the 17th century. So what are the religious or civil religious elements that link American Puritanism in the 17th century with wokeism today? I think there are basically three characteristics that the two have in common.
And I talked about the piece Carlos wrote, responding to Hans-Georg Moeller. This is one of the things he hit on. He first hit on how wokeism is used by the empire. But he then talks about wokeism's roots in philosophy and tries to trace wokeism's roots in philosophy, which Hans-Georg Moeller obviously traces it through a religious line, says it stems from religion. And Carlos, I think he agrees with that, but he says it also stems here in philosophy. You have liberal philosophers who want to put individualism and identity politics above, any kind of material class struggle. So hopefully we'll be able to publish Carlos's work on that here soon, and y'all will know what he's talking about because we've covered Hans-Georg Moeller.
Number one, a certain claim of moral superiority, a certain uncompromising emphasis on thick values that we have and the others lack. Number two, a certain messianic zeal, a missionary spirit, the insistence on the need to spread our values universally. And then, along with this, thirdly, a strong dualistic good-evil distinction. In line with the pariah principle, there is no room left for mediation. You're either with us or against us. Importantly, I think this shows how wokeism actually connects very well with Jordan Peterson's style alt-rightism.
And people have gotten mad at me before too for saying socialism shouldn't be based on your morality. And morality is really just a form of communication. And if your socialism is based on morality, you're going to be tricked into supporting the empire. Because they weaponize this moralizing language, right? Like, oh, Yugoslavia or Milosevic in Serbia is doing a genocide. So if you don't support NATO carpet bombing his country, destroying their industry, poisoning their agricultural sites, destroying power plants and hydroelectric plants that the people of Serbia and former Yugoslavia are dependent on, then you support genocide. You have to support destroying their whole country with bombs. Otherwise, you support genocide that the UN and the Hague said there was never any evidence for and cleared Milosevic of the charges that NATO used to justify the carpet bombing of his country. But the media and the American liberals and the politicians use moralizing language, weaponize moralizing language to make you feel like a bad person if you don't support it, right? So even to this day, you have a bunch of socialists who support the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, right? Because they're like, oh, there was a genocide going on. I'm a bad person. I'm an immoral person if I don't support this. And as I was explaining earlier on stream with Domenico Lacerdo's tree, socialists support self-determination, economic independence, and then civil and political rights, which grow out of self-determination and economic independence. Right? So this is a scientific way in which we decide, how we are against imperialism. We are against, the overthrow or the meddling in the self-determination of any country's people, or the meddling or destruction of their economic independence. NATO's carpet bombing of Yugoslavia both took their self-determination away, and by bombing 170 state-run factories, agricultural plants, power plants, whatever else, they massively harmed the people of Yugoslavia's right to economic independence, as did the U.S. sanctions and IMF and World Bank infiltration. So that's why we're against the NATO bombing, right? It's a scientific way of looking at it. There are material things that the U.S. was doing in Yugoslavia that we were against because they prevent the construction of socialism and overall human flourishing. Versus if I just look at everything with my morality, it's very easy for the American media to trick me, right? Oh, Milosevic is an evil dictator. We've never seen anything like him since Hitler. They kept comparing Milosevic to Hitler. He's Hitler, he's Hitler, he's Hitler, he's Hitler. If you don't support bombing him, you basically support Hitler. And, me as a new socialist looking at this with my morality, it's like, well, I'm a socialist. I don't support genocide. Socialists are, of course, against genocide. And of course, I'm against dictatorial governments. Of course, I'm against Hitler. So I must be against Milosevic and in favor of the NATO bombing, because you don't have a scientific way of analyzing these imperialist actions in which you can say, no, I'm against the NATO bombing, because even if Milosevic is doing a genocide, carpet bombing his country isn't going to help. The imperialists will obviously have ulterior motives for carpet bombing his country. They think that Yugoslavia's factories are competitors with theirs, or the Serbian factories are competitors with theirs. And they have all these social welfare programs set up to which allow the Serbian surplus to be reinvested in their people. And as U.S. multinationals, we want to siphon out that surplus. So just bomb all the state-run factories. And if you don't support it, you support genocide, right? You need more than just morality and feelings if you're going to make important and concrete political analysis and political determinations.
They are both just two different wings of the same civil religion. They are representing a schism of Western civil religion. Number 3, guilt pride is at the heart of wokeism. Let's listen to Christopher Mott.
Now, this also creates this weird, unstable narrative because a big part of social justice rhetoric around today and domestic politics is kind of about how America is this uniquely evil country that has this intense historical guilt. But so I can already hear a lot of people saying, I spelled out in the report, but I could see a lot of people who just read the summary could be saying well, how does that work, right? These are the same people that are reading White Fragility and talking about how they're born inherently with racism, it's the mark of Cain, inverted or whatever. But it's actually quite easy to see, because if you are uniquely a self-flagellant, if you will, if you are look how guilty I am, I'm just so guilty, I need to be punished, that type of worldview, it's very easy to see how you could turn that around and say, we have this important historical reckoning, and we're having it with our past, and we really encourage other countries to do the same thing. And of course, if other countries don't do the same thing, of course, because every country has a different history, every country has a different cultural context, has different problems with various minority groups within it. It's an open door in a way to criticize another country's domestic politics on the international level. And the more guilty and virtuous you appear, the more I think you can argue that point.
Here.
Yes, and this is something some of my Chinese friends have noticed, Chinese Marxists who operate now within the American left, or who have seen how American left circles operate. There's a competition to see who can be the most woke, right? To see who can be the most empathetic and the most self-flagellating, and talk about how America is literally the most uniquely horrific thing ever. There's nothing good that can be recaptured from our history, and the whole thing just needs to be burned and destroyed. That's the ultimate, woke position. It's there's a competition going on between American leftists to virtue signal and and be the most woke, rather than be the most pragmatic, right? Rather than looking at our current conditions and asking, okay, given America's horrible history of white supremacy and capitalist imperialism, how can we combat this in the modern day? How can we be pragmatic and organize and do things in a way that actually helps us bring about an end to this? Instead of that materialist, pragmatic strategizing and analysis, there's just like an idealist, individualist competition to be like, well, my form of socialism is when literally all of the white people leave and go back to Europe and we burn America and we balkanize it. It's like, okay, maybe morally you think that because of the settler colonial genocide, all the white people should go back to Europe, but like pragmatically, materially, it's just not going to happen. So what's the point, right? Like we need to look at organizing the people who are here, the people who were born into the country in the modern era, uniting those people, uniting those workers, and uniting those struggles of different oppressed groups against the capitalist ruling class who currently dominates the imperial government, the Imperium, as they call it in this video. And if we're not even thinking about that, if we're not even thinking about organizing, or if, our wokeist politics have brought us to the point where we think organizing, isn't even worth it. It's not even worth organizing people in America because it's just too far gone and we just need to wait for the country to collapse and devolve into civil war and be balkanized. Then you're not going to spend your energy and effort organizing, right? You think it's impossible. And even if you don't think it's impossible to organize socialism in this country, if you're distracted by just moralizing and by trying to, see more woke than your comrade, or hate America more than your comrade, like you're not thinking about pragmatic ways to organize. You're not thinking about how to organize your workplace. You're not thinking about the material things people in your community need. You're not thinking about how to get people mutual aid and theoretical education, right? As Jiangju said, who's one of my Marxist buddies from China, he's actually from Taiwan, who has been observing and criticizing the American left. He tweeted today, Eastern communists are pragmatic. Communists in China or Russia or the DPRK or whatever else, they're pragmatic. They're looking at how to bring their country forward, move their country forward, actually bring about self-determination for the working mass and economic well-being. Versus communists in the West are idealist, right? We're talking about these ideal utopias that we'd like to turn America into, and criticizing and criticizing our friends for not using the right woke language or not, appealing to the same utopia that I want. And it's like, there are no utopias. This is what Marx was saying from day one. There are no utopias. We need to be pragmatic, right? And this sort of individualist liberal competition to see who can hate America the most and be the most self-flagellating, it's not pragmatic, and it's not going to actually bring about liberation for anyone, which is the whole point of this. Even though, I'm sure people will accuse Midwestern Marx of being anti liberation of various oppressed groups because we have a criticism of wokeism.
Mott very nicely summarizes the guilt pride logic, which is at the heart of wokeism. There are two things, though, that can be added to what.
Sorry. Thank you, Comrade 727, for giving me an example of what I was talking about. Like I said, a lot of leftists are just going to hear the word woke and then melt down.
Mott said. Number one, this guilt pride logic, I think quite clearly, has its roots in contemporary German Erinnerungskultur, or memory culture, which is at the center of the new German reverse nationalism, which builds a sense of superiority, of moral superiority, and of a certain moralist political mission on the basis of not only accepting but publicly proclaiming guilt for the Holocaust. Secondly, it's quite clear that the guilt pride mechanism corresponds to Christian ideology. The admission of guilt or the admission of sin is at the same time the condition for the admission to heaven. It is.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut him off there, but I just thought of a good example, the black squares on Instagram. Everybody had to post a black square for BLM. It's like, if you didn't post a black square, are you really BLM? It's sort of everybody signaling support for, this sort of cultural reckoning, which, now the ruling class and the imperialists are co-opting wokeism and using it for empire. So, by getting everyone to signal their support for it, publicly signal their support for it, it's exactly what Hans-Georg Moeller is talking about. It's everyone, it's drawing everyone into this individualistic sort of liberal idealist identity politics competition to see who can be the most self-flagellating, when really, posting black squares on Instagram is just a personal thing. It's just a personal virtue signal for you to say, I am not a racist person, even though I live in a country founded on white supremacy. And it doesn't do anything to materially improve people's lives. It doesn't do anything to actually liberate oppressed groups. It doesn't do anything to actually make black people's lives better in America, or attack the militarized police system or the prison industrial complex, which preys on black people. All of these things are still functioning and still making money for the ruling class, as, we're posting black squares on Instagram, like, look at me, I am so much more woke than my friend who didn't post the black square. It's just pure individualism and idealism.
Confession that cleanses the conscience of the confessor and makes him or her a better and superior person. Number 4, academics are the priests of wokeism. Mott writes, elite overproduction has increased the pool of humanities graduates beyond society's ability to employ them. And that's true. The academic industry produces fierce competition for fewer and fewer and less well-paid jobs inside and outside academia. And as Mott says, a systemic moralism has resulted from this, which is partly driven by a highly competitive professional class vying to secure their position in the system by using virtue signaling to demonstrate class solidarity to the higher ranks. So we've ended up with a new class of academic priests, a mass of educated intellectuals without proper function in the real economy, and they are becoming some form of self-reinforcing ideological class, competing for a few jobs with a currency of holiness virtue signaling.
So that's a very good and very Marxist analysis of how overproduction and control of production has created a lot of people around my age who are going into academia and getting degrees, but then, society doesn't have that many jobs for them once they get out. So it's also creating this crisis of student debt. But he's talking about the academics and the professors sort of being like the priests of this civil religion of wokeism. And I mean, at many institutions today, you basically, before getting a job in academia, you have to do a diversity statement. Basically a statement saying how committed you are to woke politics, trying to get oppressed identities and oppressed identity groups into the college. Focusing, basically what they want you to do is recruit and try and get people to the college who are of minority groups or various oppressed identities, which isn't the worst thing ever. I think it would do a lot more to actually make college free, and cancel student debt and make college available to oppressed communities more so than it would to have the professors do this diversity statement or wokeism statement. But I don't think the purpose of it is to make sure that the academies are actually helping out oppressed groups, right? As Hans-Georg Moeller says, the idea is sort of to filter people out, right? In order to join this class of priests, this academic class of priests, you have to signal your adherence to wokeism, right? You have to signal your adherence to the struggle of different identity groups, which of course we support the struggle of different identity groups. But as I just said, I think the solutions are material, right? The solutions aren't me working for a college and then trying to be, less racist or more woke individually. It's good to combat your own racism and understand your own blind spots, especially when you grow up in a country founded on white supremacy and stuff. But what really is going to help get more oppressed groups into higher education is getting rid of the insane cost of higher education, right? Getting rid of the insane bubble of student debt that hangs over so many young Americans, including myself, right? If you cancel that and get rid of that, you're going to have, more opportunities for young people to go into higher education. but you're not allowed to make these material analyses, right? Or the academy isn't allowed to push for these material changes. They want you to push for just individualist, idealist, or as Hans-Georg Moeller would say, wokeist changes.
And using this currency for gaining professional recognition and competing for a few elite positions. Number 5, wokeism is militant. Let's listen to Mott again.
Also, I wanted to, since
Also,
we're talking
the
about
German
institutions
Green
that are.
I don't know if you paid attention to that, but the German Green Party is a really interesting example.
Oh, well, Baerbock, exactly.
As a whole, yeah, they have a whole bunch of these people. It's very weird.
It's very interesting to hear Mott talking here about the Green Party. It's a very interesting historical case. When the Green Party was founded in the early 1980s, it had basically 2 ideological pillars. Number 1 was against nuclear power generation, and number 2, a radical pacifism. In this way, it distinguished itself from the 68 leftist movement, out of which it had grown, because the leftist movement, of course, focused on anti-capitalism, on somehow solidarity with the working class. That was not what the Green Party did. The Green Party instead was rooted in liberal German Protestantism, which is very different from American evangelical Protestantism. It's kind of very liberal, very progressive. And at that time, the Green Party's pacifism tied to Protestant, German, European religion also expressed itself in large anti-war demonstrations at the time, or better, anti-rearmament demonstrations, which were directed against NATO weapons being stationed in Germany. And I do remember the slogans of the time because I participated in some of these demonstrations myself, like Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen, make peace without weapons, or stell dir vor, es ist Krieg und keiner geht hin, imagine there's war and no one goes, or nie wieder Krieg, war never again. Now, recently, the Green Party in Germany has totally changed course. It shifted from its traditional pacifism to a new militarism. This dialectical shift, although it happened much faster, I think somehow mirrors a shift we also see in the history of Christianity, which also began with pacifism and an emphasis on non-violence and peace and love, and then ended up in crusades and with violence against heathens and even non-conformist Christians during the Inquisition. In Germany, we saw in the person of the foreign minister, Green Party foreign minister Baerbock, and the Green Party Vice Chancellor Habeck, we see this shift happening very quickly in early 2022 at the occasion of the Russian war against Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, the Green Party representatives still said, we are against delivering weapons to a war zone. They very rapidly shifted tone and are now among the prime advocates for sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine. And they're very much behind the remilitarization of Germany and actually reinvested 100 billion euros into the German army. At the same time, also for military purposes and for the purpose of making war against Russia, the Green Party is now advocating a temporary, at least, the return to coal energy, and is even considering a return temporary to nuclear power generation to make up for the gas or the oil that is no longer purchased from Russia. This amazing and very fast ideological shift shows again, I think, that Mott has a very strong point. Wokeism is now used as the ideology justifying and supporting an emphasis on military confrontation. Somewhat ironically, this shift is still officially labeled by the Green Party as wertegeleitete Außenpolitik, value-based foreign policy.
I've given so many materialist examples of wokeism being used to justify imperialism in the US, but this might be the best one, and the one that, as Hans-Georg Moeller says, shows the dialectical shift, shows the imperium or the empire shifting towards wokeism to justify their aggression. And social democrats, sort of like the Green Party or so-called leftists, lining up with the ruling class and with the empire in times of crisis, right? Which is what we talked about at the beginning of the stream, how social democrats always side with fascists and imperialists, like the Azov battalion and the Nazis in Ukraine, armed and funded by NATO. And we saw this shift in the Green Party, who were previously against NATO armament, but then as soon as it became trendy, and as soon as the U.S. was saying we need to attack Russia because they're, not only are they invading Ukraine, but they're also anti-Western, right? They're anti-Western, they're anti-woke. They still like socialism because of the Soviet Union. They're just, completely opposed to liberal democracy and our values. And there was even a West German commentator on TV, who let slip, basically saying, we need to keep in mind this is Russia. Russia's not like the rest of Europe. They don't have our level of civilization and our values. And this is exactly what Hans-Georg Moeller is talking about. We are woke. We are civilized, and we need to civilize the non-woke hordes, and this used to be Christianity. Right? We have our values and we have civilization here in Europe, in the white man's land, but elsewhere they don't, and that's why we need to carry it out and bring Christianity to these other places, bring our values to these other places. And now you're seeing, like with the Green Party, this material example, the same exact thing is happening with wokeism. They're shifting from an anti-war stance, a materialist, anti-NATO, anti-rearmament stance, into, value-based imperialism. Really, the Green Party is shifting towards leading with our values, meaning idealism, utopianism, wokeism, and which, of course, as Hans-Georg Moeller says, lends itself perfectly to imperialism in the modern era. And the main conflict of imperialism versus anti-imperialism right now, the U.S.-led proxy war in Ukraine. Oh, got a super chat. Thank you so much. If feudal lords in Marx's view were a hereditary traditional elite opposed by the progressive systems, is wokeism about reproducing this? Traditional elite opposed by the progressive class system, is wokeism about? Is wokeism reproducing the progressive class system, or is wokeism reproducing the hereditary traditional elite? Are you saying that wokeism reproduces the elites, the opposed by the progressive class system? Yeah. Just clarify for me what you mean, but thank you so much for the $5. You see Ted Cruz slam Latin socialist countries and Marxists. Thank you, Left is Best. I did see that. It's literally the next video we're going to watch. So yeah, let me just finish this up. Let me finish up this video about wokeism, and then I will answer all your questions. Thank you so much for the $10 though. Reproducing the progressive class system's destruction of the traditional elite. I think wokeism is being used by the elite, right? Wokeism is being co-opted and utilized by the elite to justify their materialist imperialism, their economic expansion, and their control of markets and resources abroad. So I don't know if it's reproducing anything from feudalism. I would say it's a reproduction or a sublation of Christianity, as he said, as Hans-Georg Moeller says, of the Christian faith that feudal lords, even, I mean, they used whatever faith was popular in their region or at their time, but especially the early capitalist imperialists, like the British, said we need to spread civilization to Africa, or Christianity to Africa. I think wokeism is a reappearance of that idea in a new and secular form.
Clearly, the values that are employed here are woke values, and clearly the foreign policy is a foreign policy that is geared towards militarism. Where is the Friedrich Nietzsche today in Germany, who points to the deep ambiguity of this emphasis on Werte or values?
Great video as always. He's such a good philosopher, Hans-Georg Moeller is. Please check out his work. Check out his other videos about wokeism. And yeah, he ends it there with exactly what we've been talking about the whole video and with the way he started the video. This is just value-based idealism or utopianism being used to justify imperialism. So, this is another form, a sublation, another version of what they've always done. Our values are different from their values. We need to attack them and spread our values to them, whether it be our Christian values, which have given us civilization, according to the imperialists. We need to spread them. Or whether it's human rights. We're not going to actually define what we mean by human rights materially. We're just going to accuse country A of abusing human rights, and therefore we're justified in doing whatever we want against them. Idealist value, or it's the empire using idealist values to justify materialist aggression. That is basically what wokeism has become, and in how it's become co-opted by the ruling class. Great video from Hans-Georg Moeller. All right, left is best. Did you see Ted Cruz threaten Latin American or LATAM socialists and Marxists? How should Latin America prepare? LATM is short for Latin America. For a second, I was like, what does that stand for? Latin America. How should Latin America prepare for even more active measures by the U.S.? I can only think of alliance with China, which is immune to Western sanctions. Yes, alliance with China is good, but as Vijay Prashad says, that's not everything, right? You can't, socialists around the world can't just look at China and be like, wow, China's doing really good. I'll just sit back and relax and let them, carry out world revolution. It's not going to happen, right? China's helping countries develop themselves. They're helping the proletariat come about in countries who have been prevented from developing by imperialism for years. But the solution is still for these countries to struggle for socialism, right? The solution is for all of Latin America to do what Venezuela is doing or what Bolivia is doing. Have the working mass take control of the government, start creating systems of worker democracy, creating systems like Venezuela's Popular Assembly or their commune system, which allow them more control of the government, more political democracy, and more control of production and economics, more economic democracy, socialist democracy, and struggling against empire, right? Asserting themselves as a force against empire the way that Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua have done. And there's countries moving that direction, right? You have countries electing social democrats, but usually, those social democrats have been like Pedro Castillo or Gabriel Boric, where they folded to the empire. They've been like, yeah, I'm not a far right-wing extremist, but Venezuela and Cuba, they're evil because they're socialist. Ooh. Basically giving lip service to the empire while being better than having a reactionary or a right-wing imperialist in power in Chile or wherever else. So yeah, the answer is to struggle for socialism, and of course, as I always say, the main answer, those countries are struggling for socialism. The working masses are getting organized; they're doing their best. And countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have been struggling against imperialism for years, trying to build socialism. But what would help all those countries more than anything would be if we got socialism in the U.S. or in the U.K. or in France or in Belgium or in any of these countries who have been holding Africa and Latin America under the boot of imperialism and exploiting the crap out of their resources for years, right? If we could take out the imperialist ruling class and turn our own country into a workers' state, that would weaken the empire so much, right? Which that's not something Latin Americans can do. Obviously, they're focused on their own struggle. But that's what we should do. I meant economic alliance like BRICS. Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I totally understand what you're saying. And that's what I meant by, yes, closer ties with China. And that's what I meant by China is developing the productive forces in these countries while not just spreading socialism to these countries. That's what BRICS is doing, allowing countries to build up their productive capacity, allowing them to develop real productive infrastructure, which creates real value for their people. And in doing so, you also create the proletariat, the working class starts cooperating as productivity increases, and you create the possibility for socialism. a possibility that in many countries has been prevented by imperialism, because imperialism stops countries from developing their productive forces. All I'm saying is that China's not doing the ideological part, right? They're not doing the struggle for these countries. These countries still need to struggle for socialism themselves. China's just helping these countries build up their material base, build up their productive base, which helps their people survive imperialism and creates the possibility for socialism. Because you can't do socialism, in a country without any industry or without any productive capacity. Which is why imperialism protects or prevents productive capacity and destroys productive capacity and infrastructure, versus China and the Belt and Road Initiative build up productive capacity. Because China wants countries to progress and eventually progress forward towards socialism. The US wants to hold countries in poverty and continue to exploit them so we can selfishly accumulate. Or not the American masses, the American ruling class, the American political class, because that wealth do not really trickle down. That needs to be the primary objective with American socialists. Definitely. And as this comrade was talking about here, Ted Cruz recently went on a tirade while in Latin America, probably because he's angry about what China's doing. He's angry about the Belt and Road Initiative. He's angry that Daniel Ortega, the socialist president of Nicaragua, and Nicolas Maduro, the socialist president of Venezuela, condemned Nancy Pelosi for her visit to Taiwan, refused to recognize Taiwan as anything except for part of China, which it is and it has been for hundreds of years. The U.S. is angry and indignant. They are indignant that they can't enslave the world anymore. That's exactly what Daniel Ortega said. And he hit the nail on the head with that one. That is what Ted Cruz is doing in this video. And that is what the U.S. empire is doing right now. They're throwing a literal temper tantrum because the rest of the world doesn't want to be enslaved anymore. Because China, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Syria, all these countries are forging closer ties and forging closer alliances, especially China with their Belt and Road Initiative, which are, forging countries together in an alliance against the U.S., a pole against the U.S. We're moving into a multipolar rather than unipolar world. But also helping these countries develop their productive forces so they can feed people and so they can house people and so they can have infrastructure and survive, because the imperialists and the imperialist financial organizations like the IMF and World Bank have prevented so many of these countries from doing this for years. So now China's coming in and undoing all the damage and destruction that the U.S. has done in many ways, or not undoing it, but moving past it and moving beyond it and moving towards development. And then fat losers like Ted Cruz living in Miami, accumulating the wealth of empire and getting paid by his donors, throws a temper tantrum. Let me enslave you, Latin America. Let me enslave you, China. You guys are dictators because you're not letting me keep your people as slaves and steal all your resources for my mansion that I earned by doing imperialist aggression for my donors. And they throw a little hissy fit. Well, I mean, it's hilarious to watch. Hilarious to watch Ted Cruz's bitch ass melt down.
We don't support Marxists in Latin America, and any leftist leader who chooses socialism will be held accountable by the United States.
Guess what? Guess what, you tubby piece of shit? You don't get to control Latin America anymore. They can choose socialism if they want. And they have chose socialism, even though with Operation Condor, you and the U.S. intelligence agencies tried to torture and kill every single leftist in the continent. They're still moving towards socialism. They're still choosing socialism. And there's nothing the U.S. can do about it anymore. Cry harder.
Already, 9 governments across South America, Central America, and the Caribbean are controlled by socialists. All of these governments, with only one exception, are also overtly and ideologically anti-American. Colombia will become the 10th government in the region controlled by the hard left when the country's new president, Gustavo.
They're not anti-America. They're not. Kayla Pop, one of our writers, went to Venezuela and interviewed some of the Chavistas, some of the socialist leaders, about America. There are many interviews with Fidel Castro where he says the same thing. We are not against the American people. We are not against the American masses. We are not against the American workers. We are against the American empire. The American empire, which is made up of bankers and industrial capitalists and political elites like Ted Cruz, accumulating wealth and not only stealing and exploiting wealth from the global south and the rest of the world, but from their own people, from the American masses who are the ones sent to fight and die in these wars for imperialist aggression and expansion. So it's not that these countries are anti-America, Ted Cruz. They're anti-you. And you are trying to trick us, the American workers, into thinking they're against us. But we're not stupid anymore. We're not going to let you deceive us anymore. And we know that's not true. We know we have more in common with the Latin American proletariat than we do with the politicians and oligarchs of our country who are trying to exploit both us and them. Continue to throw a temper tantrum about it.
Petro will take office. I am deeply worried that once he does, Colombia will join the ranks of anti-American forces in Latin America. Petro is the first openly Marxist to be elected president of Colombia. He was brought to power by Colombia's leftist fringe, including guerrillas and terrorist groups. Colombians are well aware of what has happened in other Latin America.
Actually, we talked to some of the Colombians who organized for Gustavo Petro, who were part of his campaign, and they weren't using guerrilla tactics. There are guerrilla movements and rebel groups in Colombia, but that's because the U.S. literally occupies Colombia. There's an insane amount of U.S. military bases and U.S. military presence and U.S. NGOs there. Hugo Chavez called it the Israel of Latin America. They're constantly, the U.S. constantly uses Colombia to attack and launch coup attempts at Venezuela. But they did win via election, right? That's why those rebel groups exist, because they're fighting against the literal right-wing occupation of their country, right? But they won via election. But the organizers told us that they were getting shot at, or people were risking death, and campaign managers and staff were being killed because there's so much right-wing violence and neoliberal violence that the U.S. has brought to Colombia, and they've continually maintained a stranglehold on Colombia. So even though these people are literally getting shot at while they try and vote, getting shot at by groups backed by the U.S., who's apparently in Colombia bringing them democracy while shooting people trying to vote, even despite that, they still elected a Marxist. They still beat the U.S. and the neoliberals. You occupied their country with guns and AK-47s and every cent that the American, a bunch of American tax dollar money, spent that on controlling Colombia, and you still couldn't win. What a fat L. RDR, seems like the woke stuff ignores cap. Okay, I'll answer that after this.
American countries that have elected or have seen leftists seize power. Cuba and Venezuela, for example. I don't want to see Colombia follow the example of other socialist governments in the Western Hemisphere. We know where that leads. Both Cuba and Venezuela used to be prosperous countries until leftists came to power. Castro and the communist revolution succeeded there. Maite Sonia fought in the counter-revolution against Castro. Mexican President López Obrador seems intent.
We know where socialism leads. My family fought in the counter-revolution. That's where socialism leads, is it, Ted? To the U.S. funding and arming fascistic counter-terrorist or counter-revolutionary groups to try and destabilize any country that builds socialism. It leads towards crippling U.S. sanctions. It leads towards destabilization, death, and hunger caused by the U.S. to prevent countries from developing themselves. That's a great example of where socialism leads. It leads the U.S. to throw a temper tantrum and fund counter-revolution. But even after years and years and years and years of doing that, socialism is still winning, which shows why you, Ted, and your family hate it so bitterly. Hate it so bitterly because you just want to keep accumulating wealth and keep killing those darn pesky brown people in the global south who are trying to rise up against imperialism. And now you're throwing a temper tantrum as imperialism is on the decline and socialism is on the incline. And yes, your grandparents who fought in violent US-backed right-wing neoliberal counter-revolutions and killed socialist organizers and leaders for empire and for their own accumulation of wealth, yes, they fought for nothing. They fought on the wrong side of history, as did you, Ted Cruz, because socialism will win.
On making these trends worse. The Colombian far left gained momentum and Petro was elected. Petro says he will work hand in hand with Nicolas Maduro's oppressive regime in Venezuela. He is looking to work with the National Liberation Army, a terrorist organization in Colombia. He will embrace the FARC. FARC is an organization of Marxist-Leninist narco-terrorists. How great!
And FARC, I was talking about this with my friend the other day, who's got a lot of very close friends in Colombia who don't like Petro. They're not socialists. But the U.S. has been in Colombia so long. Look at Ted Cruz's angry, stupid face. But the U.S. has been in Colombia so long, occupying them, funneling their money into Colombia. And apparently it was to fight the drug trade, right? Apparently America needs to keep tons and tons of military bases in Colombia, not to threaten Venezuela or launch coups at Venezuela or enforce sanctions on Venezuela or prevent Colombia from electing or putting a left-winger in power. It's to fight the drug trade, right? Yet FARC is still a thing, right? FARC still has control in in Colombia. Gustavo Petro is a former rebel from FARC. And the U.S. is still, oh, they're narco-terrorists. They're Marxist-Leninist narco-terrorists. If that's true, and that's why the U.S. needs to be there, why is there still narco-terrorism? Why haven't we been able to stop it? Why haven't we done anything about it? It almost seems like the U.S. isn't there bringing human rights and fighting terrorism and fighting narco-trafficking. It seems like that's an excuse for us to be there so we can keep a permanent military base in Latin America and also prevent anything like this from happening. Prevent Colombia from electing a left-winger who might try and kick the U.S. out of their country. And it almost seems like FARC isn't going away because the Colombian people realize this. They realize the U.S. has installed neoliberal dictatorships, violent neoliberal dictatorships against them. And so they've taken up arms in resistance. If they were just gangs selling drugs, you would think the U.S. military would be able to take them out. But that's not what it is. It's a grassroots thing that's never going to go away because, as we said at the beginning of the stream, socialism will always follow capitalism wherever it goes. It will always be the antithesis of capitalism until it grows to the point where it can destroy capitalism. And that's what we're seeing in Colombia, and that's what Ted Cruz is having a temper tantrum about.
An anti-American Marxist in a close ally of ours in Latin America.
An anti-American Marxist. We only need counter-revolutionary terrorists like my grandpa. That's what he fought for. I'm Ted Cruz.
What's up, guys? Alex here.
As I kind of stole Kyle Kalinske from Secular Talk, his impersonation of Ted Cruz. I'm Ted Cruz. Yeah, cry harder, Ted. All right. Another super chat here. Thank you for the support. Seems like the woke stuff ignores capitalism in its monopoly stage as the reactionary enemy. Instead, it focuses on the rural or petite bourgeoisie. So the imperialist monopoly capital class have co-opted wokeism in a lot of ways. Most corporations, used Pride Month not as a way to really bring about liberation of LGBTQ people, of course, but those corporations only cared about their profits, right? And these are the richest companies in the world. And now, even weapons contractors like Raytheon and Boeing, it's almost like the meme where Republicans drop bombs on countries in the global south, but Democrats drop bombs on the countries in the global south with a BLM flag tied to the bombs or a pride flag tied to the bombs. That's basically the direction we've seen weapons contractors go, to the point where they're literally arguing, Russia doesn't have our woke values. That's why we need to continue funding Ukraine. That's why all of Western civilization hinges on the war in Ukraine. A lot of weapons contractors have said that. A lot of them argued that we needed to stay in Afghanistan and that Joe Biden was hurting us by withdrawing from Afghanistan because we need to stay there and protect women's rights. This is another argument that the weapons contractors used. It is in my opinion, and in the opinion of Hans-Georg Moeller, and I think this is what the evidence shows, the ruling capitalist class, the monopoly capitalist class, rather than the petty bourgeoisie, have embraced wokeism. It is sort of like a professional managerial class thing. It's definitely more of a popular thing with the PMC and the petite bourgeoisie versus the working class. But there's also a lot of like petite bourgeoisie, like Trump people. There's a lot of like petty bourgeois people who literally voted Trump because he was anti-woke. They just hate that stuff. Which I'm not saying we should, tailor our message to those people, petty bourgeois Trump supporters. But I think the petty bourgeois can go either way on wokeism. Versus, I think the ruling monopoly capitalist class has largely fully embraced wokeism. And now you have the liberals and the neolibs like Biden and Pelosi sort of acting as the representatives of that class, versus Trump and, the more Trumpist Republican Party probably do represent the more anti-woke petty bourgeoisie. And in doing that, they get, a handful of the workers on their side just because the workers are like, yeah, I'm part of the non-woke party, even though they're going to send my kids to fight and die in war and allow my wages and healthcare to be cut. Woohoo. So another good point too, though, that Hans-Georg Moeller points out in his brilliant criticism of Jordan Peterson, where he calls him the mirror of wokeism. Wokeism goes both ways. So like I said just there, you have Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, this class of this class of politicians who represents the monopoly capitalists, not just the petty bourgeoisie, the weapons contractors, insurance industry, bankers, all these mega oligarchs who fund their campaigns. They represent these guys, and they do so by being woke, right? And especially with the rise of Trump, sort of this petty bourgeois / pseudo populist, anti-woke, rogue politician, and the Republican Party sort of lining up behind him. You have the mirror of wokeism, right? You have, we're anti-woke. We're not anti-woke because we think wokeism is idealism and we want to improve your life materially because we want to raise your wages and give you health care and give you housing and, help employ you. And we think that, the solution to society's problems aren't in individualist wokeist solutions. They're in material solutions. That's not what Trump was saying. He talked about ending the wars and bringing jobs back a little bit, but he was mostly just like, I'm anti-woke. I'm anti-woke. The libs are woke. And that's why they're bad, right? The libs aren't bad because they pretend to be woke while not, doing anything to improve people's lives materially. The libs are just bad because they're woke. And Jordan Peterson is the exact same thing. So then you can trick, a good percentage of the country who's involved in politics into what's become known as the culture war, right? You have those who think wokeism is good. Wokeism is progressivism. Wokeism is just society moving forward. And that's represented by the liberal monopoly capitalist class, who are really imperialists and exploiters and are, oppress various different minority groups themselves, active in the oppression of it, versus the Republican Party, who are, we're anti-woke. We don't care about that PC crap. We're really cool. Ron DeSantis is that dude. Trump is that dude. Like, they just aren't woke, so they're super cool. And as I said, neither party, then neither of these opposing sides are in favor of changing people's lives materially, are in favor of improving people's lives materially. Nobody's getting at the root of capitalism's problems, which are, of course, rooted in production and the relations of production. So you have two classes fighting over identity, neither of them rooting the problems of society and production, which as Marxists we know they are. And that's really the main way that wokeism is used to keep people distracted, keep the working mass divided. There's a great Hans-Georg Moeller video called the Mirror of Wokeism. So yeah, thank you for the support to RDDR who sent that super chat. And thank you for the great question. And thank you for making it a more Marxist question, right? Like, okay, if we're Marxists and we're doing scientific analysis of wokeism, what does the petty bourgeoisie think of it? What does the PMC think of it? What does the proletariat think of it? How are classes, different classes, responding to this phenomena? And then how do we organize based on that? It's not just having this broad, wokeism equals evil, because that's how you end up supporting people like Matt Walsh or, goofball Republicans who are sitting on hordes of accumulated wealth while pretending to care about the workers. I wouldn't say they've embraced wokeism. I'd say they learned how to wield it, and they only when they wish. Yeah, I mean, it probably depends on an individual level. I think that a lot of academics and a lot of professional managerial class people really have embraced wokeism, and they're like, this is how I can help change the world for the better, is by, exclusively focusing on issues of identity politics, And a lot of those people are political liberals, right? They think Marxism has always failed. They think socialism has always failed. They think America and the Western world are the best examples of societies or countries in history. And therefore, how do we make these societies better? Well, we all get better as individuals. Don't change the class dynamics. Don't criticize the empire, or things that stem from the relations of production. So I think, a lot of academics have internalized it, and I think that comes out in their writing. But at the end of the day, that's just liberalism, right? That's just liberalism and idealism and imperialism, which, like I was saying with Hans-Georg Moeller, wokeism is a changed form. It is a changed form of the ideology justifying imperialism. But it's got the same basis, right? It's got the very same basis of like, those guys don't have human rights. We do have human rights. Attack them. Those guys don't have Christian values. We do have Christian values. Attack them and spread Christian values, spread human rights, spread wokeism. And of course, in reality, the U.S. empire isn't spreading anything except for exploitation, destruction, violence, right-wing ideology. Like, you really think the Azov Battalion and IDAR and Right Sector, these neo-Nazi political organizations who the U.S. has propped up and supported in Ukraine, you really think they're pro-LGBTQ? The giant white neo-Nazis engaging in the drug trade who have swastikas tattooed on them, those guys are going to create a really tolerant liberal democracy for people of all identity groups? Like, give me a break. Materially, these people who claim to be the most woke are supporting, the most right-wing, oppressive, racist, xenophobic regimes. Regime, that's like a word of the U.S. empire. Any government that does what the U.S. wants is a government. Any government who doesn't do what they want, regime. Can't be a regime. Gotta be a good government. Greetings from the Balkans, American comrades. Greetings, comrade. Wow, I'm glad you made it. Someone from the Balkans doesn't hate us. Woo! Just kidding. I've gotten a lot of support from Balkan people in the Balkans being like, I see you've met right-wing people from the Balkans. And I've also talked to a lot of people who are like, I left the Balkans and came to America. The Balkans are horrible and I support NATO and bombing of the Balkans. And you need to listen to me because I'm from there. And I'm always like, I don't know. I'd rather talk to people who are living there now. And also, a lot of the people living there now have really right-wing politics that I still disagree with. So it's almost like you can't base your politics off of identity. That's another way identity is used to justify imperialism. That is another really, really common way in the way that it's used to moralize and treat people like bad people for not supporting imperialism. You'll have the diaspora, like, people like Ted Cruz, who came from Cuba, whose dad or grandpa or whatever was a reactionary who fought for the counter-revolution against socialism. People like that violently fight against socialism on the side of the U.S. empire. And when socialism wins, they flee the country to the U.S. empire. And then the U.S. media uses them as a talking point. Oh, this is Steve. He's from Cuba. He thinks socialism is evil and he thinks we should destroy Cuba. It's like, okay, I'm not going to just believe Steve because he's Cuban, right? What class background is he? You know, what political party does he belong to? What are his beliefs? What are his principles? But the empire never goes into any of that. They never say, you know, Steve owned a plantation with a bunch of slaves on it that got seized by the revolution. And then he fought with the right-wing U.S. imperialist-backed counter-revolutionaries and tried to kill Fidel and destroy the government before fleeing to the U.S. to continue doing right-wing politics. They won't tell you about any of that. They won't give you the historical context or his class background. They'll just be like, this is Steve. He's a Cuban guy. He says to overthrow the Cuban government. Ah? Ah? The Cuban guy said it? Which people say that people have tried to use that on me so many times with Cuba. So many times. I am from Cuba. You don't know what you're talking about. Shut up, white boy. It's like, I run Midwestern Marx with Carlos. He's literally from Cuba. His whole family was in Cuba in the 90s. He moved to America as a very small child. But like his identity means nothing because he's pro-socialism. And that also shows why it seems like everybody who leaves a socialist country seems to be like a right-winger or against that country. One, it's a cultural thing, right? Everyone here thinks socialism is evil. Everyone here thinks China and Cuba are evil. So if you come and start living here, you know, you're going to get social acceptance if you say that those countries are evil. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that a lot of those people or a lot of reactionaries, right-wingers, fled the country, and the U.S. in many cases helped settle them here because they find them politically useful. And then because they're politically useful, the U.S. media blasts these stories, you know, over a loudspeaker. They're never going to interview people who are enjoying living in China or Cuba right now, or they're never going to talk about how people in Cuba don't have housing payments the same way people in the U.S. do. They're not going to talk about any of the good things. Or they're not going to interview somebody who got evicted from their home in the U.S. and compare him to someone in Cuba who has government-funded housing and say, look how much better socialism is. Of course not. They're going to take the right-wing reactionary whose dad owned a plantation or whatever, and they're going to stick a microphone in his face and say, talk about how evil Cuba is. We'll blast it over a loudspeaker to all the Americans. And that is how identity gets used to justify imperialism. DYT. Thank you for another $5, RDDI. The polarization of society over globalization is making it hard to polarize it over capitalism. Left and right is just pro versus anti-globalization. Do you think the polarization is no. I think it's actually like in Russia there were recently a video leaked of Putin talking to the communists. Right. And the Communist Party got second in Russia's last election. And Putin has had to nationalize various parts of the energy sector and reinvest those things in Russia's economy because the Socialist Party and the Communist Party has so much power, influence, and momentum in Russia. So if Putin doesn't do some things to appease the socialists and to appease the working masses, like nationalization of energy and reinvesting that money in the people, then he's not going to win an election, right? He's not going to get the working class or communist or socialist vote. And thus Russia is continually, you know, as they've been drawn into this battle with the U.S., whether you have the actual war in Ukraine or, you know, Russia funding and sending troops to countries like Syria, who the U.S. is trying to destroy, I think you've seen Russia's economy and their politics move closer to socialism as they've been drawn into this sort of multipolar battle. As of, you know, Iran is an Islamic republic, but Iran's economy looks very similar to China's or socialist economies. And they're constantly making socialist countries their allies, allying with Venezuela, allying with China, as Russia is doing. So I think really the globalization has allowed the battle lines to be drawn sort of similar to how they were in the Cold War, where it appeared as socialism versus capitalism. Now, China and the other socialist countries have learned from the Cold War, right? They're not going to put a target on their back and talk about spreading socialism to other countries. You know, China says we don't export revolution. But as globalization has continued and capitalism has continued to advance, you know, even though these multipolar countries haven't called themselves a specifically socialist bloc, you know, that's sort of what it's becoming, right? That's sort of what it's becoming just naturally, because in order to combat the U.S. capitalists and oligarchs are just doing whatever they think is going to make them money, right? There's ideology behind it, but they will always go back on their values, or, go back on something they said, or act as hypocrites as soon as it's materially, as soon as it's going to be valuable for them materially, right? So the empire is just run by banks and oligarchs, trying to go or destroy whoever is threatening their exploitation and make the most money, and then they justify it afterwards, right? Versus China and countries like, in order to combat that, you have to understand what the US's interests are, that their interests are material, and that they're trying to expand and control markets, resources, and exploit and enslave the globe. And then you have to not only combat that, but in doing so, you sort of have to combat capitalism, which is why all of these anti-imperialist countries, even ones that aren't socialist like Iran and Russia, they've continued to nationalize more of their industry as they do this. They've continued moving closer to more of a socialistic planned economy. Because in order to combat the US capitalist empire within a global system of capitalism, you have to combat capitalism itself internally, right? You can't let the economy be run, or the government be run, by a bunch of capitalists, because the capitalists in your home country will just ally with the Western capitalists, who are much richer and have much more power, and they'll enrich and accumulate wealth for themselves while allowing the masses to get screwed, right? You have to, in some ways, take economic control from the comprador class or from the capitalist class, and reinvest it in the public and the masses if you're going to combat imperialism, is what countries combating imperialism have learned. And that's what has increasingly been happening all around the world. And so, yeah, I don't think you can combat imperialism without socialism in a strict economic sense, right? You could, like Iran can combat imperialism without necessarily making socialist ideology the leading ideology or the official ideology of their country. Same with Russia. But materially, they're still combating imperialism, and as they do so, they materially move towards a more socialistic economy. Because the two things are so deeply intertwined, because globalization, like you said, is just capitalism reaching its imperialist stage, right? Imperialism isn't just violence against countries the US doesn't like. It is a stage of capitalism, a global stage of capitalism, which has long been dominated by the Western capitalists. So in order to fight capitalist global imperialism, you need to move towards socialism internally. Yeah, great question again. Thank you. By the way, I tried to defend you on Twitter, but the comments you get about being non-woke are insane. I know. I know. I just don't go on Twitter, really. I made a new account where I can tweet about how silly I think those people are and just rant. But yeah, it's like, I mean, if you want an example of how wokeism works, I guess go on Twitter, go to the mob of people attacking us on Twitter, and then say, like, just try and have a conversation with them, right? Try and have a conversation and give any of the materialist, evidence-based analysis about wokeism that we've given or that Hans-Georg Moeller has given. And they won't listen to you. They won't listen to you. They're going to freak out. They're going to call you a bigot. They're going to call you a dumbass, and then they're probably going to block you. Because they've been inundated with the ideology of wokeism, which also means like cancel culture. If you don't check all these boxes and support all of these identity issues and prioritize all these identity issues, and even at this point, because we've explained so many times that we do support the struggle and liberation of oppressed groups, we just think wokeism is being used to prevent that liberation. Even though we say that, people still accuse us of being bigots and being against the liberation of oppressed groups, just because we won't use the word woke, right? Because they associate wokeism so strongly with liberation that if anybody criticizes the word woke, they'll attack that person and dismiss that person, not based on evidence, just based on the fact that they're not woke, which, as Hans-Georg Moeller says, it acts very similar to religion. If you don't hold my religious values, my religious beliefs, I hate you. You're evil. You're an enemy to be combated. You're against Jesus and God and everything I hold dear. It's very similar with these liberals or rad libs on Twitter. We'll explain, we think wokeism is being co-opted by the empire, and we support the liberation of oppressed groups, but wokeism is being used to prevent the liberation of oppressed groups. And they go, you bigot! You hate oppressed groups! Why aren't you woke like me? And then I log off of Twitter. That tends to be how it goes. Is the Discord link on Patreon working? It should be. Let me adjust it. Here, let me put it in the link tree. One sec. The Discord server makes me so angry. The link always expires. It's supposed to be an unlimited link. It's literally supposed to be a link that never goes away. But it keeps expiring. And it's so frustrating. So frustrating. All right. But I will put the link. Well, I'll just post the Discord link in chat right now. How about that? How about that? Expire? Never. Never. I never want this link to expire. Please. So I'll send it in chat. There's the link to join our Discord. Please join. Public Discord where we discuss all sorts of things. And then, sorry, I just want to make sure that it's working on the link tree. And then shoot me a message. So there's a special channel within the Discord server for Patreon supporters. So if you're a Patreon supporter and you're not in the patrons only channel, shoot me a message on Discord or on Patreon and I will get you in there ASAP. Yeah. And also, sorry, we have our Midwestern Marx link tree. And this has a link to just everything we do. We have a link to our Discord in here, link to our podcast, link to where you can listen to our podcast on Spotify. Thanks, you guys kick ass. You're good on theory. Good source of orthodox Marxism. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I appreciate you for sending the super chats today and asking really, really, really good questions. I can tell, like, that's the thing. If people ask me questions about wokeism or have criticisms of what I'm saying about wokeism, and you bring them up, I'm more than happy to engage in that. And, that allows us to flesh out this idea more, and you expand this theory more. And ultimately, I think from this conversation today and from the questions that RD Doctor was asking, we all learn more about the empire. Right? But that's not what angry mob Twitter leftists or radlibs are interested in. Right? They don't want to learn more about the empire. They don't want to have these conversations. They don't want to engage with these arguments on their merits. They don't want to engage with anybody who disagrees with them even slightly. They just want to dismiss everyone as like a reactionary bigot for not, checking all the boxes or saying all the right things that, appeal to what we call wokeism. And it's like, that's how wokeism and cancel culture and this stuff, the idea of wokeism as a civil religion, that's how dogmatic, idealist, civil religious thinking prevents us from getting smarter, prevents us from organizing, prevents us from understanding the world better. And this has always been the case with dogmas, which is why I really like Hans-Georg Moeller's way that he conflates wokeism with the new form of civil religion. But not an expert on Nazism, but I feel like privileging identity above all else is how Nazism worked. They elevated Aryan and German identity and oppressed others. Yeah, and people have taken to calling this reverse racism, right? And reverse racism is something that's mocked on the left when you have white people in the U.S., a country built on white supremacy, being like, I am so oppressed, right? Or someone said something mean to me or made a joke about me being Mayo-skinned. This is reverse racism and having a temper tantrum about it. That's something we rightfully mock, right? But race essentialist ideology, right? Them, as you said, elevating identity above all else is, the same ideology as liberal imperialism, or when taken to its utmost extent, Nazism, because it's based in race essentialism, right? If you think that racial issues and racial divisions aren't rooted in production and they aren't rooted in material factors, then you're saying that you think there's something inherent to certain races that makes them different and makes them fight with each other. That's not true. That's racist. That's race essentialist. And yeah, that's what a lot of people are saying, right? Because they refuse to acknowledge how the ruling class uses race essentialism, and propagates racism to divide people. And yeah, it's sort of like you said, it's like the mirror of Nazism. It's like the imperialist alliance NATO is killing people and dominating the entire world. And then they're saying we need to do this, because we're elevating identity above all else. So therefore, we can destroy a country, destroy their economy, as long as we say that we're bringing them human rights or that we're making them woke. Because you elevate identity above the material, you elevate idealism above the material, and then you can justify anything. So yeah, race essentialism is sort of the same ideological or theoretical base of racism and wokeism, as it's used by the empire in the modern day. Great observation there, comrade. And for more analysis on that, check out my buddy Zhongzhu on Twitter. Any sort of essentialism is anti-human flourishing and anti-left. Honestly, anti-human flourishing is the most base way you can put it, because humans are not perfect, right? And humans are not homogeneous. We are all different, and we all make mistakes, and we all change with time, right? And it seems like a lot of the left has forgotten that. Nobody changes. Everybody's either a racist or an anti-racist, and if they're anti-racist, don't talk to them, cancel them. They're a bigot, not even worth engaging with. They're literally evil. Yeah, some of these people I talk to on Twitter, I'm like, how do you even, if you think that me and Carlos and our criticism of wokeism makes us bigots, how do you even function in the real world? Because then literally everyone you run across who's not like an online Twitter leftist who spends 8 hours a day on social media, you're going to think they're a bigot. So how do you even interact with people? And it's always like professional managerial class, or like wealthy petty bourgeois looking like college students or even high schoolers who say this stuff, which is probably just an infantile disorder. I imagine a lot of people will grow out of it, but a critique of wokeism should be accompanied by anti-racism. I agree, yeah, and that's always what we try and do, right? That's why we've done these streams, criticizing wokeism. And that, I guess, looking back, that was maybe my one criticism of that one tweet I made, saying, the empire fears the anti-imperialist non-woke left. Maybe I should have explained what I meant by non-woke better. But I still conflated wokeism with the empire, right? And if you're a Marxist doing an analysis of the empire right now, how can you not realize that the empire is utilizing wokeism? Or at least co-opting the struggles of various oppressed groups. So I thought I was. And then, of course, we explained it further below. But at that point, the Twitter mob was on us and nobody cares. So, but nobody cares about the Twitter mob less than me. So that's one of my biggest flexes. So I'm an online commentator who's not beholden to people online. I tweeted one from my personal account. This was a little mean. I was like, if you have friends in real life, you don't even have to care what people on Twitter say. It's crazy. Not implying that the people who cancel us on Twitter, spend all day on Twitter calling us bigots, don't have friends in real life. I'm sure one of them or two of them do. I'm sure one or two of them meet up on weekends to go to a coffee shop or something. Easy, just live online, Ella. Exactly. That's why they have Minecraft now. You can eat and sleep and take care of yourself and build your own house online. No need to leave. No need to leave. I think that a lot of these people online that act this way have serious problems and they spend way too much time online. Jinx, Benjamin. We literally said the same thing at once. Yeah, I worry about some of them. Not the ones who are just vitriolic and totally mean and just clearly are just trying to get clout, get a bunch of likes by piling on with the mob. I don't really care about care about those people. Someone says you're probably talking to the feds, LOL, on Twitter. Yeah, and I think there legit is, tons of Fed infiltration on the left, whether it just be astroturfing certain kinds of tweets, bot accounts which like a certain kind of tweet, which the CIA and Fed finds is helpful, imperialist tweets, stuff like that. But yeah, a lot of them are real people who I think, like, I was looking at some of these accounts who were coming at us at one point, and some of them tweet so many times every day. It's like they're literally on Twitter all day. They, like, you can scroll, and they'll have like literally like 30, 40 tweets within an hour. Some from them, some just retweets. But then it's like that every hour. It's like, whoa, how much time are we spending on this app? And like, what kind of effects does that have? Yeah, and then these people like can't engage with arguments, especially not an argument that's longer than 140 characters. And everyone's attention span seems so little. It's like, what are the ill effects of everyone being on social media so much, and for so much of our political dialogue taking place on social media? And I'm one to talk. I'm on TikTok, but that was like why I started the TikTok. I was like, kids are watching this anyways. It's just a bunch of dancing videos and like duck faces and thirst traps. Like, if I just get on here and start talking about Marxism, I bet you some people are hungry for that. Some people want actual education and actual brain stimulation beyond just a quick little dopamine hit you get from a 2-second TikTok. So yeah, I don't know. I worry about that, especially with being on TikTok, because I've met so many people now. I've met so many people, including people in real life, who follow me on TikTok and who know me through TikTok. And one thing I'm always trying to do is give them like almost like Jordan Peterson-esque, like clean your room life advice. Because I've always said that's what I think is the good part about Jordan Peterson, is he tells kids to clean their rooms and get their own life in order. And Jordan Peterson says, don't worry about society, just worry about yourself, And I think you need, worry about yourself, get yourself stable as you can be, educate yourself, develop yourself, so that you can develop society, so that you can better understand society and better act as an agent of change. But, a lot of leftists don't do that. They just complain about society and talk about how society is, evil and terrible, and there's nothing good that can be salvaged from society at all. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with kids being online too much. And it's not optimistic. And I do think, it's good to develop yourself. So that's what I always tell kids: read, exercise, join clubs at school, join sports, go outside and, be in community with your friends and family. Because these things will help you internally. They'll help you develop and be stronger and happier, which will make you a better, revolutionary or better political actor, better agent of history. Don't spend all day online. Don't let your spouse spend all day scrolling through social media, stuff like that. Try and put good stuff into your brain and your body. And yeah, don't just like let yourself go and be like, capitalism sucks, I'm just gonna not care about myself at all. Yeah. I'm always trying to tell kids that on TikTok, like, close the app, go read. And there's so many kids who tell me my attention span's too short to read, at all. I cannot read, period. I'm like, is it though? I mean, I understand, people have legit learning or reading disabilities and stuff, but how many kids are just, spending all day on TikTok or playing video games, and it's just constant dopamine to the dome, and they'd rather do that than they would read, even though reading is more fulfilling and makes you feel better in the long run. It's not that quick hit of dopamine that you get from a 2-second TikTok video. So I think a lot of kids are just choosing TikTok videos rather than reading. And then they're like, oh, I just can't read, or if they have an anti-capitalist analysis, like, oh, I'm too busy with capitalism to read, which could be true. But it's like there have been people in horrible poverty and horrible working conditions throughout history, in countries under the full boot of Western imperialism, where the people have literally taught themselves to read. The working mass have taught themselves to read by reading Lenin's State and Revolution and reading theory, and because they knew it would help them organize and liberate themselves. It's like, no matter how busy you are, it's always worth it to find time to read. And you can do it. I believe in you. Okay. Yay, books. Books don't have ads. Exactly. Attention is robbed from us by social media. Yes. Don't let them rob your attention. All right. All right, y'all. I think I'm going to head out now. This has been a great stream, 2.5 hours almost. I will edit some of these here in a bit and put them on YouTube. I took a break from streaming just because I was on vacation with my family. But now we are back. The regular streams are continuing once again. Hopefully next time I'll be on here with like Carlos or Noah or whoever else. But yeah, if you want to support us, go to the link tree. You can help support our project on Patreon. Patreon is how I'm able to come to you now. It's how we pay for Streamlabs and for lighting and the camera and this microphone and maybe even my laptop. I can't remember if we bought that with Patreon money or if I bought that myself. But either way, your money is what makes our project go. Your money is the reason Carlos and I haven't starved yet. Just kidding. We take $100 stipend a month from the Patreon. But yeah, that's how you can support us if you want to do so financially. If you cannot, liking, commenting, and subscribing helps boost us in the algorithm. So I've been told by the YouTube fairies and the YouTube gods. All right. Thank you, everyone. Viva la revolution. Onward to socialism.